My name is Neil Davison, and I am a professor in the School of Writing, Literature, and Film, and I've been on the Holocaust Memorial Committee for 19 years. Aside from the horrors, injustices, and ironies that one learns of studying the rise of Nazism and the attempt to genocide the Jews and the Romani people of Europe, one of the most daunting secondary recognition one gains is the understanding that the end of Nazism was not the end of genocidal activities during the post-war period of the 20th century and beyond. Our speaker tonight, Professor William Miles, has become at this point in his career as a scholar of modern Jewish studies an international authority on this sad yet essential fact of our world. Professor Miles' work on how the Nazi Holocaust operates in the culture, politics, and consciousness of African nations and other third world nations indeed led to the first pioneering international symposium on third world views of the Holocaust, which was held in 2001 at Northeastern University, where Dr. Miles was and remains a professor of political science. At that conclave, prominent scholars from Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean reflected on the influence of the Shoah on their own thought and the conversations within each of their respective cultures about memory, imperialism, subjugation, and political mass murder. Professor Miles holds a PhD from the Fletcher School of Diplomacy at Tufts University and has taught or been a visiting researcher literally all over the world, from a fellowship at Ben Gurion University in the Negev in Israel, to work in Nigeria, to teaching in both the lycée and prison systems in France, to research at the University of Antilles, Guyana in the Caribbean, and to early Peace Corps work in the Republic of Niger. From 1998 to 2000, he held the Stokesy Chair in Jewish Historical and Cultural Studies at Northeastern, and earlier in his career at that institution helped to create an international concentration in the university's Masters of Public Administration program. He's been the recipient of 2 Fulbright Awards for research in Africa, a National Endowment for the Humanities Summer Research Stipend, and a teaching position at the Center for Advanced Studies at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. His work as a cultural historian has produced several books and articles in premier scholarly journals, journals actually too numerous to mention, but I'll tell you about some of his books. His early monograph, Zion in the Desert, published by State University of New York Press in 2007, was a finalist for the National Jewish Book Award in the category of Modern Jewish Thought and Experience. Another finalist for this award, this time in the category of Contemporary Jewish Life, was his 2013 Marcus Wiener imprint entitled Jews of Nigeria, an Afro-Judaic Odyssey. Most recently, Professor Miles has published another monograph with Marcus Wiener Publications entitled Afro-Jewish Encounters from Timbuktu to the Indian Ocean and Beyond, and that was published just this year, 2014. Tonight, Professor Miles will speak to us about his work with African countries that have suffered mass murders and genocidal events during their colonial and post-colonial periods, and how the Nazi Holocaust of the Jews has entered the vocabulary of those cultures' politics, education systems, and general public conversation surrounding their own confrontation and historicizing of their national tragedies. Please join me in welcoming Professor Miles to OSU and the 2014 Holocaust Memorial Program.
Thank you, Professor Davison, for that kind introduction, and thank you, Professor Kopperman, for extending the invitation on behalf of the Holocaust Memorial Week Committee, many of whose members I met this evening, and I very much appreciate the work that you've been doing year after year to keep this an annual tradition at OSU, and it is a distinct honor to be included among the distinguished visitors and lecturers that you have been bringing here for the last 27 years, is it? I'm just curious how many people were here last night when Tom Segev spoke. I know that there was a power glitch or something that made it difficult, but Tom Segev and wrote a very influential book called The Seventh Million, and that was the focus of what he discussed yesterday, if I understand correctly. And Tom focused on the 1 million survivors of the Holocaust, Jewish survivors of the Holocaust, who did make it to Israel afterwards. And that is a normal focus, if you will, a Jewish focus on the Holocaust and its implications beyond. Looking at how Jews themselves coped with the horror of the Holocaust. The perspective of European witnesses to the Holocaust, what historian Raoul Hilberg calls the bystanders, that has also been a well-trodden era of scholarship. And the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum has extended that focus to the liberators, Americans, who helped those survivors of the concentration camps leave. That museum in DC opened in 1993 for chronological reference. So in the nearly 70 years since the end of World War II and the Holocaust, study and commemoration of the Holocaust has expanded into ever-widening circles. Concentric circles, if you will, if you could keep that image. And this widening of Holocaust consciousness is due to three phenomena. The first is a universal interest in absolute evil. This is universal. And Nazism did represent absolute evil. The second phenomenon that I think explains the expansion of Holocaust consciousness throughout the world is what I call, well, globalization, the relatively recent phenomenon of globalization. And the third is what I call indigenization of the Shoah, of the Holocaust. Indigenization, by that I mean the way in which, even in the third world, scholars, writers, intellectuals, teachers have come to incorporate into their worldview this most tragic of European, of Western tragedies. Globalization and indigenization have vastly extended awareness of the Holocaust to circles of learning and empathy unimaginable in 1945. And this month, this year, is a particularly fitting time to look at perhaps one of those furthest of concentric circles, Sub-Saharan Africa. Because it's 20 years ago this month that the genocide in Rwanda erupted. And it is also 20 years ago this month that the final nail in the apartheid injustice of South Africa was removed when Nelson Mandela was elected president and universal suffrage came to a nation in Africa that had experienced not genocide, but lead-ups to the kind of mass killings that we did see in Europe. So this is the focus. African, black African consciousness of the Holocaust. Now, I'd like to digress for just a minute to explain how it is that I came, even against my own self, to such a study and a focus. And I was talking with David right before the audience, and he'll relate to this, because as a college senior, I broke completely with the life I knew growing up on Long Island in a Jewish environment by joining the Peace Corps and spending 2 years in a remote, impoverished, French-speaking, Muslim, desert nation in West Africa. It was difficult on some levels, but on one strange Jewish level, it was exhilarating to live for the first time in a society in which nobody had ever heard of Adolf Hitler. Nobody could imagine something as horrible as the Holocaust. And anti-Semitism? No, not at all. It was liberating for somebody who had grown up in an environment in which the Holocaust was so much a part of one's worldview. And I was born only a decade after that. But you know, the shadow of the Holocaust is inescapable. After I came back from the Peace Corps, and I started doing graduate work in international relations, I got into an academic career, and I took my first sabbatical in Israel. 1994, turn on the television, and I saw those horrible images that some of you will remember of bodies floating through the Kagera River in Rwanda, falling off the rapids of Victoria Falls, victims of a genocide in my life, in many of your life. As I struggled to understand how this could have happened again, I was amazed to learn that for an entire century, since the colonial era, the Tutsis, the targets of this government-organized genocide, had been defined as foreigners, strangers with Middle Eastern origins, perhaps even in ancient Israel. This theory is known as the Hamitic hypothesis, and it stems from the name of Ham, the son of Noah. Some of you have seen the movie now. I don't know if Ham makes it into that version of the movie, but in the Bible, he is cursed in the book of Genesis. And his descendants, according to the Hamitic hypothesis, populated parts of Africa, including Rwanda. Part of that Hamite people, the Tutsis, were thought to be, as descendants of perhaps ancient Israelites, different, foreigners, strangers, who really didn't belong there, and their superiority culturally, economically, politically was thought to prove it. And the majority Bantu people, or the Hutus in the context of Rwanda, came to resent that. And the Tutsis themselves never rejected their status as a chosen people, but their chosenness was more colonial than divine. And in 1994, they were chosen for death. At least 800,000 murdered in 3 months. And that figure and that intensity exceeds even the Nazi killing machine at its most efficient. Some people put it at 1.2 million victims in the course of 100 days. So as Professor Davison mentioned, in 2001, I convened the first ever symposium on third world views of the Holocaust. And one of the presenters at that Holocaust symposium, Loxley, spoke from the perspective of the African diaspora, representing a movement called Reparations to Africa and Africans in the Diaspora, whose founding charter invoked, quote, exploring the modalities and strategies of an African campaign of restitution similar to the compensation paid by Germany to Israel and the survivors of the Nazi Holocaust. Another African invitee to that event examined Ethiopian, this is Edward Kisi. He examined Ethiopian rebels of the 1970s who cast themselves as Jewish in their war against a regime that they called Hitlerite, fascistic, and they accused the state of running a concentration camp state. All language that, of course, is familiar to those sensitive to the Holocaust. A third speaker was the then Rwandan prosecutor of crimes of genocide, Gerald Gahima. So I'd like to have us listen to a few minutes of what he said at that event. If I can find the button.
The people of Rwanda can relate to what happened to the victims of the Holocaust. We too have had our experience of a genocide. We understand the disappointment that our people feel when the entire world abandons them to destruction and stands by and does nothing as a genocide is being committed. We share the frustration with the victims of the Holocaust that real justice for their injustice seems unattainable. We too have come to the realization that our people who are targeted by genocide, all themselves and future generations, are duty to ensure that they do whatever it takes to ensure their survival. As long as genocide remains, justice still remains important, and people ask, why must there be justice? Why must we hunt Nazis? Why must those people who committed genocide or who may commit it in future be pursued and prosecuted? As lawyers, we have a very simple answer. We say it's the law. You commit a crime, you have to be punished. It's a very simple answer that even a child will understand, but it does not explain everything. Unlike the Jewish people, the people of Rwanda, victim and perpetrator have got to live together, to seek to build their lives anew, living side by side. Not everyone would have the opportunity like the Jewish people had of establishing a new state, like Israel was established in 1948, to live alone in one homogeneous society where you know, as a society, you all focused on working for your survival without having to think about coping or living or coexisting with your former enemies. But in societies like ours, justice is very important, because unless there is a reckoning with the past, there is no foundation for reconciling people.
So I'll go back, I'll mention later this important distinction between victims of a genocide, the Holocaust, who were able to restore their lives by creating an independent state, the State of Israel, and the victims of the genocide in Rwanda, who have to live side by side with their former persecutors and perpetrators of murder. That is a challenge that is very humbling, and that Rwanda, unlike Israel, has had to deal with. So, I'm sorry, if you're interested in the wider topic of the impact of the Holocaust beyond Africa, There is a website that will be available through linkage through the OSU, Holocaust Memorial Awareness website. And there are the full transcripts and some videos from people from other parts of the world, and this happens to be the one from Cambodia. And I also brought a few copies of the summary of the symposium that anybody who's interested in, I did bring some copies afterward, and I'll be happy to share with them. Otherwise, they will be on the website as well. So I'd like to share with you 3.5 more minutes of video, if I may, to explain how it is that I came to know about Gerald Gahima, the prosecutor of genocide crimes in Rwanda, to bring him to my campus. So just 2 caveats. One, there are a couple of moments in the video that you don't think anything's happening because I transferred from VHS and I'm not very technically adept, but it does work. You'll see those 3.5 minutes, but more importantly, there are a few images of what I described seeing on television in Israel during the Rwandan genocide itself, of victims of that genocide.
For people who might be interested in organizing genocide in other African countries, the lesson of Rwanda is very simple and clear. The lesson is that it's possible to plan and carry out a genocide, exterminate 1/7 of your country's population, and get away with it.
When the terror stops, its victims seek justice. But how can it be found in a country full of killers? Gerald Gahima has come to Jerusalem to meet a Nazi hunter and ask him where to begin.
The key component of justice is that those people who committed these crimes will be forced to pay a price. They won't be allowed to live out their lives as if nothing happened, as if hundreds of thousands weren't murdered, as if innocent babies weren't tortured, as if innocent grandparents were torn to pieces. What kind of justice is that? That people who committed these crimes will be allowed to live out their lives in peace and tranquility? What kind of world is that?
In Jerusalem, Gerald Gahima visits the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, to discuss how to pursue justice, how to destroy the culture of impunity, how to end the cycle of violence. To be trials, but how far down the ranks should the guilty be pursued?
Since the bulk of the population was involved in this violence and the crimes were serious, they call for the sentence of capital punishment. You cannot sentence the whole population to death. The whole point of what we are trying to do is to ensure that at least some of the leaders are brought to justice. It's justice for purposes of education. It's not a very easy solution because if you have a simple peasant woman whose husbands, whose kids have all been killed, it's very difficult to explain that the perpetrator of that crime against his family should be forgiven because the perpetrator happens to be an illiterate, poor peasant like her.
So the new Tutsi-led government is considering prosecuting just a few prominent cases. But those who are accused warn that any retribution will fan the flames of resentment.
those final scenes are trials that are being held in Rwanda themselves for the highest level of the perpetrator. Trials were also undertaken under the auspices of the United Nations, the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, in nearby Tanzania, without the death penalty. In Rwanda, the death penalty was theoretically imposable, but as I'll explain later, the tendency has been much otherwise. So I traveled to Rwanda 7 years after the end of the genocide, and one of the things I did was to attend trials to see how justice is being done under that context. And I also attended a commemoration called Life After Death. It was the first international gathering for people who wanted to provide solidarity to the organization of survivors called Ibuka, which means survivor. No, it means remember in the Rwandan, Rwandan language, Kinyarwanda. Remember. Remember. It's the name of the Association of Survivors of the Itsembambuka, which is the indigenous word for genocide in Rwanda. These are members in attendance there, most of them survivors of that genocide. It would be the equivalent of 1952 in terms of the Holocaust Parallel. A co-sponsor of that event was the government of Rwanda, whose president then and now still is Paul Kagame, who led the army that overthrew the genocidal regime in Rwanda. Also in attendance was a Holocaust survivor, Hedy Fried, who is now a psychologist, and with Yael Danieli, an Israeli, works with trauma victims both of the Holocaust and second-generation survivors as well. One thing that I noticed when President Kagame gave his speech was his use of the Hebrew word Shoah for Holocaust in referring to what did happen in Europe in the 1940s and why nobody can fully appreciate what happened to his country and his people without that context, that world context of evil that was visited upon people of another culture, religion, color. Part of the visitation had to do with going to sites of genocide. And again, that's Hedy Fried, with a survivor of the Rwandan genocide. Cemeteries. And a wreath-laying ceremony, and this was one of the places where a stranger, a survivor, would come to me and ask, "Why are you here? Why have you come to Rwanda?" And all I had to do was say, "I am Jewish." And they would nod. They would understand why a Jew from America would come to Central Africa. This is a school in Rwanda. It's called Murambi. And these are school children who are coming to visit what was the site of perhaps the most horrible killing that went on, because it was the school children themselves who were killed in their dormitories. On display are the clothes taken from the victims, put on display so that there can be no denial of the genocide. And genocide denial is happening in the context of Rwanda, less known perhaps than Holocaust denial, but it is there. And knowing of the dangers of denial, which is the equivalent of the second killing of the victims, they have decided to do something that struck me as rather grisly. They put on display not only these clothes of the victims, but they have decided to leave bodies where they were killed in the dormitories. I'm not showing you pictures of that. I wouldn't take a picture of that. But this image, which the previous one reminded me of, I'm sure somebody here would recognize what this refers to. These are the shoes that the victims of the Holocaust, that the Nazis would take, and for as many other parts of personal property. And this is from the museum in Auschwitz-Birkenau, still on display today. Piles of, in this case, shoes. There are other piles of glasses, spectacles, suitcases. The need to show tangibly, this happened here. This article of the New York Times at the 10th year anniversary, like Israel, Rwanda is a home of memories and a land of memories. Kigali, the capital of Rwanda, has a genocide museum that now has an exhibit about the Holocaust. Part of that genocide museum is about the Holocaust. Of course, most of it is about the Itsambambuka. And what has been happening in this country are programs that pair victims of the Holocaust with victims of the Rwandan genocide. This is the program for restorative justice that I did research on. I won't go into it now. But how do you recreate a society in which you want to give justice without putting to death 1/10 of the population, which is associated with murder? How do you do a program of restorative justice? And the answer is gacaca. Gacaca, which is the indigenous Rwandan approach to conflict resolution, dispute resolution, which they have elevated in this context to post-genocidal justice, in which forgiveness can be given by survivors if asked for publicly, with sincerity, by people who were not the organizers or major perpetrators of the genocide itself, but who then pledged their lives to helping the surviving members of the families whom they killed. This is very difficult to grapple with from a Western sense of justice, but it is something that I've come to learn about because of the shared parallels between genocide that I can relate to from my family history and this one in Africa. And this month, of course, as I said, is the 20th anniversary of the Rwandan genocide. And just as we meet at OSU this week, throughout Rwanda, there were ceremonies to remember that genocide under the title, Remember, Unite, Renew. So I was a stamp collector when I was very young, so I'm going to leave this segment about Rwanda by showing you some stamps that I collected during my visit that commemorate the genocide. This means let us unite against genocide. The smaller lettering says, evokes the word Itsambambuka Shoah in the Rwandan language. Orphans, victims of genocide, memory of genocide. I didn't integrate it, but now I've gone back and I found that in Israel there are stamps issued that also mark the Holocaust and the end of the war and survivors. So now, a further concentric circle, okay? We're beyond Rwanda now. Now we're in South Africa. And however unjust apartheid was, apartheid instituted government, segregation, discrimination, oppression, it was not genocide. But up until 1942, there was a direct link between what would become the Holocaust itself and the apartheid system. It was called grand apartheid, mass deportation to the so-called homelands of black Africans. That paralleled the German policy to make Germany Judenrein, to get rid of those who don't belong in the German homeland itself, or to get rid of the blacks who don't belong in the white areas of South Africa. So, forced emigration in one phase, concentration camps in another phase. And then petty apartheid, the racial laws, the racial theories, pseudoscience, that also went on in South Africa. So in 1999, the Cape Town Holocaust Center was opened, where those parallels that I just described are on display. Now, I understand that Tom Segev, when he was here, he did talk about, he may not have used the exact same language, but scholars of the Holocaust distinguish between the uniqueness and the universalist approaches to understanding the Holocaust. Was the Holocaust unique? Which is what in Israel particularly was claimed, nothing like it comparable, or is it an example of the universal evil, an extreme example, but still part of the universe of evil that humanity can witness against other parts of humanity? So the Holocaust Center in Cape Town, South Africa, as an educational institution, transcends this academic debate, because it is memorializing the Holocaust in a nation that still is emerging from great racial injustice and injustices that pose particularly challenges to world history, communal memory, and civic education. So let me explain. There was some reluctance among survivors of the Holocaust who lived in South Africa to include in the exhibit of the Cape Town Holocaust Museum references to apartheid. But those references are included in the permanent exhibit of the museum. Less expected was the extent to which the educational wing of the center would become a space for resolution of more recent conflict. So the educational wing of the Cape Town Holocaust Center receives school groups from throughout South Africa and neighboring countries, and they do professional development purposes, professional development training and programs for such groups as, and I'm sure you can't read it here, but take my word for it, the police department and the prison department. Why? And this is unique because they can use the frame of absolute evil, the Holocaust, as a safe space psychologically for agents of the state who perpetrated the injustice of apartheid to come to grips with what they did as being enforcers of apartheid, prison guards, policemen. Nobody is telling them that they committed genocide. Genocide is what you see in the exhibit, the Holocaust. That creates a space for them to struggle with what they have done and their participation in an unjust system that didn't kill people outright systematically with a genocidal intent, but still violates the conscience of the world. At the suggestion of the police force, the Cape Town Holocaust Center now brings together gang members, the heads of rival gangs, so that they can dialogue. It's not easy, but again, to be in a space where they see what absolute evil and intolerance can lead to. So, many of you know that South Africa had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission in which publicly people would have to acknowledge what they did if they were going to be forgiven. This is less key, less confrontational, less difficult. What the Cape Town Holocaust Center does now is include within its concentric circle of Holocaust commemoration, Rwanda and Darfur. It is expanding beyond South Africa. It now is doing what we're doing, commemorating what happened in Rwanda 20 years ago. And it is expanded to other parts of South Africa with the Holocaust and Genocide Foundation. It's 5 months ago that Nelson Mandela passed away. Nelson Mandela often invoked Anne Frank in the diary of Anne Frank that he read as a source of sustenance during his decades of imprisonment on Robben Island. And long after his release from prison, Mandela continued to demonstrate solidarity and empathy with all those, including South Africans, for whom remembering the Holocaust remains a priority. And in this context, I personally wish to acknowledge the presence of Laureen Nussbaum, childhood friend of Anne Frank, who is speaking tomorrow. Beyond Rwanda, beyond South Africa, even further circles of Holocaust indigenization are forming in Africa. One of them is in Nigeria, where a particular ethnic group, the Igbo, identify with Jews and Israel and have been doing so for some time. In the late 1960s, the Igbo people tried to create their own homeland by breaking out of Nigeria and creating Biafra. Then and since there has been identification between the Igbo people and Jewish people on a number of levels. One of them is being a minority within a larger group, and a minority some of whose stalwarts believe that they have a divine mission in this world for their people. These are books that were published in Nigeria that I've collected that emphasize the connection between the Igbos and Israel. They cast Biafra as a Zion, as an ideal type of state that would have a significance for them. And their failure in that war tantamount to genocide, as this graphic image shows of children who starved or were starving to death at the time. Then and now, the Igbos identify with Israel as a modernizing, embattled people, but also a model for development and advancement. And both the Igbos and Israel are seen to parallel a garrison state in a wider Muslim context. So, my most recent research in Nigeria, and Professor Davison referred to this book of mine, a new phenomenon, which is that there are Igbos today within the last 20 years who are practicing Jews, who have embraced Judaism not only in that metaphorical sense regarding Biafra, but who believe, but more importantly, observe and practice Judaism as part of their lives. This boy, Hezekiah, I met when he was 11 years old, and he asked me if I would come back to Nigeria when it was time for his bar mitzvah. I couldn't say no. So I returned, and at his bar mitzvah, which he did a great job, by the way, a lot of American Jewish boys at 13 wouldn't be able to read Torah as well as he did. There was a reception, and this member of the community, a surgeon, Dr. Michael Caliban, he wanted to remind the assembled of their past and their history. And yet, yes, it is joyous for a bar mitzvah, but, and I'm quoting because I recorded the whole ceremony, Israel must live. Amen, cried the community. Igbo must live. Amen. Israel has come to stay. Never again. Never can it happen again. And he was referring to genocide, whether it was the Biafran or the Holocaust, not clear, but when he said never again, it was clear. There is no going back. So we're coming to the furthest of my concentric circles in Africa, and this is so far away and so new that I only learned about it in preparation for coming to Corvallis, one of the reasons that I thank you for the invitation to make me refresh my knowledge. Learning about this anthropologist in Senegal, Dr. Alioune Deme, who spent a stint at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. And he is bringing to Senegal, where he is a professor, understanding of the Holocaust and bringing it into Senegalese consciousness as well. I intend to meet him when I go to Senegal this summer. So a few words about the internationalization of the Holocaust and its commemoration. of which African indigenization is just one part. And I'll go through this quickly. The United Nations in 2005, the General Assembly passed a resolution rejecting Holocaust denial, urging member states of the UN to educate their citizens about the Shoah. This was the first resolution sponsored by Israel that had ever been approved by the General Assembly of the United Nations. 2005, who was Secretary General of the UN in 2005? Kofi Annan. Of what country? Ghana. And Kofi Annan happens to be married to the niece of Raoul Wallenberg, the Swedish diplomat who took many risks to save lives during the Holocaust. And Kofi Annan has never been reticent to invoke his connection with and deep respect for Raoul Wallenberg. I'm quoting Annan here. The Jewish people have been victims of anti-Semitism in many parts of the world, and in Europe, target of the Holocaust, the ultimate abomination. This fact must never be forgotten or diminished. This is United Nations in Nigeria observing Holocaust Remembrance Day. The UN resolution also calls on member states to inculcate future generations with the lessons of the Holocaust in order to prevent future acts of genocide, and so it has an outreach program. And UNESCO, the United Nations Agency for Education and Scientific Cooperation, has its program for Holocaust remembrance, including this new survey about what is the curricula for Holocaust teaching throughout the world. And this publication, this year, 2014, it made for very relevant reading for me in preparation, and I commend it to you. So why should we in the Western world, and this is my concluding question, why should we care what is said in Africa about the Holocaust, this most Western of tragedies? You know, at the end of World War II, when the ashes of the Holocaust were being buried, before the word itself, Holocaust, was in common use, it was inconceivable that an African would one day be Secretary General of the United Nations, and that the Holocaust would be indigenized in Sub-Saharan Africa. But as we've seen from Rwanda to South Africa, from Nigeria to Senegal, this is precisely what is happening. In Pirkei Avot, it's an 1800-year-old compendium of maxims from the Talmud. Ben Zoma asks, who is wise? And then he answers his own question, and he says, the wise one is one who learns from all people. And I like to paraphrase Ben Zoma and say, the wise one learns not only from all people, but from all peoples. We live in a post-Holocaust, globalized world, one in which Sub-Saharan Africa has good reason to indigenize the Shoah. And Africa also challenges us in the West to ponder its promise of never again. Thank you.